The mining colony on Vega 7 was dying and everyone knew it, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. Kyle Hammond had been working on the water filtration system for 6 hours straight, and his hands were covered in grease and his back ached from crawling through the maintenance tunnels. The system was running at 40% capacity, which meant rationing, which meant people getting angry, which meant his job got harder every single day. He climbed out of the tunnel and wiped his hands on a rag that was already too dirty to do much good. The colony had 347 people living in it, and every single one of them depended on systems that were held together with spare parts and hope. The equipment was older than Kyle himself, and the company that owned the mining operation had stopped sending replacement parts 2 years ago. In the mess hall, he sat down with his tray of gray protein paste that tasted like nothing at all. Across from him sat Helen Carter, the colony director, who looked like she had not slept in days. She was staring at a tablet reading reports that Kyle knew would not contain any good news. The ore deposits were running thin. The equipment was failing and headquarters had stopped responding to their requests for support. "We have maybe 6 months," Kyle said quietly. "If everything holds together, if nothing major breaks down, if we can keep rationing water and power." Helen looked up at him with tired eyes. "I know I have been trying to get evacuation transport, but every ship that comes near this sector is already full. We are too far out, too expensive to reach. Nobody wants to waste fuel on a failed colony." That was when the alarm went off. It was not the emergency klaxon that meant fire or hull breach or system failure. It was the visitor alert, a sound that Kyle had heard maybe 3 times in the 5 years he had been on Vega 7. Nobody visited the colony. Nobody had any reason to come here. The mess hall emptied as people rushed to the viewports. Kyle followed Helen to the main observation deck, where half the colony was already pressed against the windows, staring out into space. Through the viewport, he saw something descending toward them, and his brain struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. The ship moved like water, flowing downward with a grace that seemed impossible for something made of metal. The hull shimmered with colors that should not exist together, silver and green and something else that hurt to look at directly. There were no visible engines, no exhaust, no signs of the crude propulsion systems that human ships used. It simply moved through space as if space itself was bending to allow it passage. "What is that?" someone whispered, and nobody had an answer. The ship docked with their main airlock with a precision that made their automated systems look clumsy. By comparison, there was a soft chime, and then silence. The kind of silence that happens when 300 people all hold their breath at the same time. Helen straightened her uniform and walked toward the airlock. Kyle followed her along with a few security officers who looked nervous. The airlock cycled and the inner door opened, and that was when Kyle stopped believing in coincidence or luck or anything except the impossible. She stepped through and the entire mining crew stopped breathing. She was tall, much taller than any human Kyle had ever seen, perhaps 7 feet, with a build that was slender, but suggested strength. Her skin had a faint luminescence to it, like she was lit from within by some gentle light. Her hair was long and moved as if it was underwater, even though the air in the corridor was perfectly still. It was silver and green and seemed to shift colors as she moved, but it was her eyes that made Kyle forget how to breathe. They were the deep green of old forests, the kind of forests that Earth had lost centuries ago, and they looked at him with an intelligence that was ancient and patient and completely alien. Her ears came to delicate points and her features were sharp and elegant in a way that made human faces seem rough and unfinished. Behind her came the dragons, and Kyle heard someone gasp, or maybe it was him. There were 3 of them, each about the size of a large dog. They moved with absolute silence, their clawed feet making no sound at all on the metal deck. Their scales reflected the harsh corridor lights in impossible ways, showing colors that had no names. Their eyes glowed like embers in a fire, and when they breathed, the air around them shimmered with heat. The woman looked around the corridor, taking in the rust stains on the walls, the flickering lights, the general air of decay and desperation. Her expression did not change, but Kyle had the feeling she saw everything. She spoke, and her voice was like music from a place that had never known war or hunger or failure. "I am Lyra of the Forest Realm," she said. and I require assistance with my vessel. For one rotation of your sun, Helen found her voice first, though it came out rougher than usual. We would be honored to help, but our resources are very limited. Perhaps you should seek assistance at one of the core worlds, where they have proper facilities and experienced technicians. Lyra smiled, and it was like watching ice melt in the first warm day of spring. I do not need proper facilities, she said. I need human ingenuity. My people have technology that is ancient beyond your comprehension, but it is also rigid, inflexible, bound by rules that cannot be broken. Your people adapt, improvise, create solutions from nothing. This is why I am here. Kyle felt something stir in his chest, some combination of pride and fear. He had spent 5 years keeping broken equipment running with spare parts that were not quite right and tools that were meant for different jobs. He had learned to improvise because there was no other choice. And now this woman, this impossible, beautiful, terrifying woman, was saying that was exactly what she needed. He found himself walking forward without meaning to. His legs carried him through the crowd until he was standing close enough to see the faint pattern of scales on her skin that made her look like she was carved from some precious stone, close enough to smell something like forest rain and distant flowers. I can help you, he said, and his voice sounded steadier than he felt. I know every trick there is for keeping broken things running. One of the dragons turned its head to look at him, and he felt its gaze like physical heat from a furnace. Its eyes were intelligent and curious and somehow amused. Lyra studied him with those ancient forest eyes, and Kyle had the uncomfortable feeling that she was reading something written on his soul. You will do, she said and nodded. Come. Kyle looked back at Helen, who gave him a slight nod. He followed Lyra back through the airlock, and the dragons fell into step behind him, moving with that eerie silence. The airlock cycled, and he stepped onto her ship, and his understanding of reality shifted. The interior of the ship was impossible. Just impossible. The corridor he walked through was made of something that was not quite metal and not quite crystal. It glowed softly with its own light, and the walls seemed to shift and flow like they were alive. The space inside was clearly bigger than the space outside should allow. The corridor turned at angles that made his head hurt, and he saw rooms through doorways that seemed to exist in multiple places at once. How is this possible? He asked. Lyra glanced back at him. Space is flexible if you know how to bend it. This ship exists partly in your dimension and partly in others. It is old technology from when my people were young and still curious about the universe. She led him deeper into the ship, past rooms that defied description, until they reached what had to be the engine room. It was a cathedral of crystal and living metal. Power flowed through it, like blood through veins visible as streams of light that pulsed and moved. The entire space hummed with energy that Kyle could feel in his bones. This is the heart of my vessel, Lyra said. The crystalline matrix that channels power it has developed. Problems that my people cannot fix because we have forgotten how to think in ways that are not perfect. Kyle stared at the impossible engine, trying to understand what he was seeing. The crystals pulsed with light, but there were dark spots, patterns of stress that he recognized even if he did not understand the technology. It looked like metal fatigue, like the kind of microfractures he dealt with every day in the colony equipment. Kyle walked closer to the crystalline matrix, and the dragons followed him, their eyes never leaving his movements. He reached out slowly, half expecting Lyra to stop him, but she remained silent. When his fingers touched the crystal surface, it was warm, and it hummed against his skin like a living thing. Tell me what happened, he said. How did the problem start? Lyra moved to stand beside him. The matrix has been functioning perfectly for 3,000 of your years. Perfect energy flow. Perfect efficiency, perfect harmony. But recently it has begun to falter. The power fluctuates, the flow becomes unstable. My people have examined it with every instrument we possess, and they find nothing wrong. Kyle ran his hand along the crystal, feeling the vibrations change as his fingers moved. There were spots where the hum felt different, weaker somehow, like a musical instrument that was slightly out of tune. He had felt this before in metal beams that were about to fail and water pipes that were developing cracks. It is not broken, he said, slowly working through the problem in his mind. It is tired. Lyra tilted her head. Tired. That is not a term my people would use for a crystalline matrix. Kyle pulled out a small scanner from his tool belt. The kind he used to check metal stress in the colony equipment. He ran it over the crystal surface and the readings made him nod. On Earth we learned a long time ago that nothing lasts forever. Metal gets tired if you use it too much. Glass develops. Microfractures. Even diamonds can shatter if the stress is wrong. Your matrix has been running perfectly for 3,000 years, and that is the problem. Explain. Lyra said, and there was genuine curiosity in her voice. Kyle sat down on the floor and pulled out a piece of paper from his pocket. He started sketching rough diagrams. When something runs perfectly, it has no room to flex, no room to adapt. If you take a metal bar and bend it back and forth, it will eventually break. But if you let it flex and shift naturally, it lasts longer. Your matrix has been running at perfect efficiency for so long that it has no tolerance left. It needs imperfection. One of the dragons made a sound that might have been amusement. Its tail swished across the floor and Kyle felt the heat radiating from its body. Lyra knelt down beside him, studying the crude drawings he had made. You are saying that perfection is the flaw, she said. Yes. Kyle said, human technology breaks all the time. We are used to it. We design things to bend, to flex, to fail safely. We build in redundancy and tolerance and room for error. Your technology is so advanced that it forgot those lessons. Lyra stood up and walked around the engine room, her expression thoughtful. The dragons followed her, their movements synchronized like they were parts of the same creature. My people built this ship when we were still explorers, she said, when we still made mistakes and learned from them. But over the millennia we perfected everything. We eliminated all error, all waste, all inefficiency. And in doing so we eliminated adaptation. Kyle stood up and approached the matrix again, studying the patterns of light. Can you show me how to access the internal structure I need to? Introduce controlled stress points. Places where the crystal can flex and absorb variance. Lyra touched a panel that Kyle had not noticed and part of the crystal matrix opened, revealing the internal structure. It was beautiful, intricate beyond anything humans had ever built. Each crystal was perfectly aligned with the next, creating a lattice of impossible precision. But Kyle could see the problem now. The perfection left no room for the tiny movements that materials needed to survive. Do you have tools that can reshape crystal? He asked. Lyra gestured and one of the dragons approached, carrying in its mouth a case that it set gently at Kyle's feet. Inside were tools that looked like they were grown rather than made. They felt alive in his hands, warm and responsive. He picked up something that looked like a combination of a laser cutter and a tuning fork. This will work, he said. He spent the next hour studying the matrix, learning how the crystals connected, how the energy flowed through them. It was like learning a new language, but the principles were the same as everything he had worked with before. Energy needed paths, needed room to move, needed places where it could expand and contract. Kyle began working carefully, using the alien tools to introduce tiny imperfections into the crystal lattice. He created microspaces where the crystals could shift slightly. He introduced deliberate flaws that would allow the matrix to absorb stress instead of accumulating it. The work was delicate and his hands were steady from years of repairing equipment with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. The dragons watched him with unblinking attention. Their eyes tracked every movement, and Kyle had the strange feeling they were learning from him, recording every decision he made, every adjustment he created. He explained as he worked, talking through his reasoning. Here, I am creating a buffer zone, he said. The crystals can shift by about 0.001%. That sounds tiny, but it is enough to absorb thermal expansion and energy fluctuations. And here I am introducing a deliberate gap. It will make the energy flow slightly less efficient, but it will prevent stress accumulation. Lyra sat on a bench that seemed to grow out of the floor, watching him work. You are teaching my companions, she said. The dragons learn by observation. They will remember everything you do. Kyle paused and looked at the dragons, really looked at them. They were not just animals. They were something else entirely. Their eyes held intelligence that was vast and patient. "Good," he said. "I hope they remember that sometimes the best solution is the one that is not perfect." Hours passed and Kyle lost track of time. The work was absorbing and challenging and deeply satisfying. He introduced flexibility into a system that had been rigid. He created room for error in a design that had allowed none. And slowly the matrix began to respond. The dark spots faded. The flow of energy became smoother, more natural. When he finally stepped back, his hands were shaking with fatigue and his back ached from bending over the intricate work. But the matrix hummed with a different tone now. Something warmer, more alive. It was no longer perfect, but it was better. Lyra stood and approached the matrix. She placed her hand on it and closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them again, there was something like wonder in her expression. "It feels different," she said. "It feels like it is. Breathing." "That is good," Kyle said. "It should breathe. Everything that lasts needs to breathe, needs to flex, needs to adapt." One of the dragons approached Kyle and pressed its head against his leg. The gesture was surprisingly gentle. The heat from its body was intense but not painful. It made a sound that was almost like a purr, and Kyle found himself reaching down to touch its scales. They were smooth and warm, and they vibrated under his fingers. Lyra smiled. "They approve," she said. "Dragons are ancient and wise. They recognize truth when they see it. You have given my vessel not just repair but wisdom. You have reminded it how to survive." Kyle felt exhaustion hitting him all at once. He sat down heavily on the floor, and the dragons gathered around him, their bodies creating a warm circle. "I just did what I know how to do," he said. "I fixed broken things by making them less perfect." Lyra knelt beside him. "That is a gift beyond price," she said. "My people have forgotten how to think this way. We have forgotten that survival requires imperfection, that strength requires flexibility. You have taught my companions, and through them you have taught me. This is a debt I cannot repay with simple payment." Kyle looked up at her. "I do not need payment," he said, "but my colony needs help." "I know," Lyra said and smiled. "I have already seen your systems while my vessel was docked. They are creative and desperate in equal measure. Come, I will show you what I can offer." Lyra led Kyle through the impossible corridors of her ship to a room that seemed to exist outside of normal space. Through the walls he could see stars moving in patterns that made no sense, and the floor beneath his feet felt solid but also somehow not quite there. She gestured to a panel that appeared in the air when she touched it. "This is a data repository," she said. "Knowledge that my people have gathered over millennia. I cannot give you everything, because that would be dangerous. Your people are not ready for certain technologies, but I can give you hints, directions. Enough to help you solve your problems in your own way." Kyle stared at the panel, which displayed information in symbols he did not recognize. But as he watched, the symbols shifted and became numbers and diagrams that he could understand. "What am I looking at?" "Solutions," Lyra said. "Water filtration using crystalline matrices that can be grown from common minerals. Energy generation from thermal differentials that your equipment can already measure. Structural reinforcement using composite materials that you can manufacture with the tools you have. These are not complete blueprints. They are suggestions, ideas. Your people will need to figure out the details, and in doing so you will learn." One of the dragons curled around Kyle's feet, its warmth seeping into his tired muscles. He reached down absently to scratch behind its ear ridge, and the creature made that purring sound again. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Why come to a failing colony in the middle of nowhere? Why help us?" Lyra was quiet for a moment, her ancient eyes looking at something far away. "Because my people are dying," she said finally. "Not quickly, not obviously, but we are fading away. We have become so perfect, so advanced, so efficient that we have stopped growing. We have eliminated all challenge, all struggle, all need to adapt. And without adaptation, there is only slow death." She sat down on a bench that formed itself from the floor, and the other two dragons came to rest at her feet. "Your people are different," she continued. "You struggle constantly. Everything is difficult for you. Your technology fails. Your bodies are fragile. You live such brief lives. But you never stop adapting. You never stop finding new solutions. You take broken things and make them work through sheer creativity and desperation. Kyle sat down beside her, his mind racing. So you come to us to remember how to struggle. Yes, Lyra said. I travel among the younger. Races the ones who still fight for survival. I watch, I learn. I remind myself that perfection is a trap. My people built ships that last forever, but they forgot to build people who could change. And now we are trapped in our perfection, slowly becoming obsolete. The dragon at Kyle's feet shifted and looked up at him with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. He felt the weight of that gaze, the intelligence behind it. These creatures were not pets or tools. They were companions, perhaps even equals. How long have you been doing this? Kyle asked. A very long time. Lyra said, I visit human colonies every few centuries. I have watched your species spread across the stars. Watched you struggle and fail and survive and thrive. Each time I learn something new. Each time I am reminded that life is not about lasting forever. It is about adapting to whatever comes. Kyle thought about his colony, about the 347 people who were slowly dying on a rock at the edge of known space. They were not special. They were not heroes. They were just people trying to survive with broken equipment and dwindling hope. But maybe that was enough. Maybe that struggle was itself valuable. The data you are giving us, he said. Will it be enough? That depends on you. Lyra said, I am giving you pieces, not solutions. Your people will need to take these ideas and make them work with what you have. That will require creativity and experimentation and probably many failures, but if you succeed, you will have done it yourselves. You will have learned, and that learning will make you stronger. Kyle nodded, slowly understanding. What about your ship? What you asked me to do? Will it last? Lyra smiled. It will last longer than it would have because you taught it to flex you, introduced controlled imperfection. You gave it room to adapt. That is a lesson my people forgot millennia ago, and I am grateful to be reminded of it. She stood, and the dragons rose with her. Come, I will transfer the data to your colony systems, and then I must depart. I have other places to visit, other reminders to collect. They walked back through the shifting corridors to the airlock. Kyle felt different somehow, like something had changed in the way he saw the universe. He had always thought of advanced civilizations as having all the answers, as being beyond the struggles that humans faced. But Lyra had shown him that advancement could be a trap, that perfection could be a weakness at the airlock. Lyra placed her hand on a crystal panel. Before I go, I will do one more thing. Your colony systems are failing, but they are not beyond repair. I will optimize them, not to perfection, but to resilience. I will introduce the same flexibility that you gave my ship. She closed her eyes, and Kyle felt something like electricity in the air. The dragons gathered around her, their bodies glowing faintly. Through the airlock window, he could see the colony lights flickering and then steadying. He heard the hum of machinery change, pitch becoming smoother, stronger. When Lyra opened her eyes again, she looked tired for the first time since Kyle had met her. Your water filtration system will now run at 80% capacity. She said your power generators will be more stable. Your life support systems will last at least another 5 years. That should give you time to implement the solutions I have provided. Kyle felt tears stinging his eyes. Thank you, he said, and his voice was rough. You have given us hope. You gave me something more valuable, Lyra said. You reminded me why survival matters. You reminded me that struggle is not a burden but a gift. Without it, we become static, perfect, and dead. The dragons pressed against Kyle one last time, their heat warming him. Their eyes seemed to look into him through him, and he had the feeling they were saying goodbye in their own way. Then they followed Lyra through the airlock. Kyle stood at the window and watched her ship detach. It moved with that same impossible grace, gliding away from the station. As it accelerated, the hull shimmered and then simply vanished as if it had slipped sideways out of reality. Helen Carter appeared beside him, her eyes wide. What just happened? Our systems are all running better than they have in years, and there is a massive data file in the main computer. Something about advanced filtration and energy generation. Kyle turned to face her. She helped us, he said. But more than that, she taught us something important. She taught us that our struggles, our constant need to improvise and adapt, that is not a weakness, it is our greatest strength. Helen looked out at the stars where the ship had disappeared. Who was she? Someone who remembers what we keep forgetting. Kyle said, someone who knows that perfection is the enemy of survival. They stood together in silence, watching the stars. Kyle thought about the data Lyra had left, about the hints and suggestions and incomplete solutions his people would need to work hard to turn those hints into reality. They would need to experiment and fail and try again. But that was good. That struggle would make them stronger. Come on, Helen said. We need to look at this data and figure out what we can do with it. Kyle nodded and followed her. But he looked back once more at the empty space where the impossible ship had been, and he smiled because he understood now why Lyra traveled the stars looking for struggling colonies, looking for desperate people making broken things work. She was learning how to survive. The colony gathered in the main meeting hall 3 days after Lyra's departure. Every person on Vega 7 was there, sitting on benches or standing against the walls. Their faces showed hope, mixed with caution. They had lived with disappointment for too long to fully trust in sudden miracles. Helen Carter stood at the front with Kyle beside her. On the main screen behind them were diagrams and data pulled from the files Lyra had left. They were incomplete deliberately, so filled with gaps and question marks. But they pointed toward solutions. Helen spoke first, her voice clear and steady. We have been given a gift, she said. But it is not a solution handed to us complete and perfect. It is a challenge. It is a chance to save ourselves if we are willing to work for it. She gestured to the screen. The data we received contained suggestions for 3 critical improvements. Water filtration using crystalline growth that we can initiate with minerals from our own mining operations. Energy generation from thermal differential systems that we already have the components to build. And structural materials that can be manufactured in our fabrication facilities. Kyle stepped forward. None of this is complete, he said. We will need to experiment. We will fail probably many times. We will need to take these hints and turn them into working systems using what we have. The visitor did not give us a rescue. She gave us a chance to rescue ourselves. A woman in the back raised her hand. Her name was Patricia Wong, and she ran the mining equipment. How long will this take? Kyle looked at Helen and then back at the crowd. I think the water filtration system could be operational in 3 months if we dedicate resources to it. The energy generation might take 6 months. The materials fabrication could take a year, but our current systems have been stabilized. They will last while we work. Another voice spoke up from the side. A young man named David Cruz who maintained the communications array. What if we fail? What if we cannot make it work? Then we will have learned something, Kyle said, and we will try a different approach. That is what she wanted. She wanted us to learn to adapt, to become stronger through the struggle. Helen pulled up a new screen showing work assignments. We need volunteers for research teams, she said. People willing to spend their off hours studying these designs, experimenting with prototypes. This is in addition to regular maintenance work. Nobody will be forced, but we need people who are willing to try. Hands started going up slowly at first and then faster. Patricia Wong volunteered for the materials team. David Cruz joined the energy generation group. A medical technician named Lisa Brooks offered to study the crystal growth patterns. Others followed. Every person in the colony found something they could contribute. Kyle felt something tight in his chest, loosen. These were not heroes or geniuses. They were ordinary people who had been ground down by years of failure and disappointment. But they were choosing to hope. They were choosing to try. Over the following weeks, the colony transformed. People still did their regular jobs maintaining the equipment, keeping the life support running mining. the dwindling ore deposits. But in their spare time, they gathered in workshops and meeting rooms. They studied the alien diagrams. They ran experiments. They failed and tried again. Kyle found himself leading the water filtration team. They started with the basics, trying to grow the crystalline matrices that Lyra data suggested. The first attempts failed. The crystals grew too fast and shattered. The second batch grew too slowly and remained inert. The third batch seemed promising, but dissolved when they tried to use them. But with each failure, they learned. They adjusted temperatures, modified mineral ratios, changed the growth environment. On the 47th attempt, they produced a crystal matrix that remained stable. It was crude compared to what Lyra's ship probably used, but it worked. It filtered water at twice the efficiency of their old equipment. Patricia Wong's team had similar struggles. The composite materials they tried to create kept coming out brittle or too soft or structurally unsound. They experimented with hundreds of combinations of minerals and binding agents. Most failed. Some worked partially. By the third month, they had created a material that was stronger than the metals they had been using and could be manufactured. With their existing equipment, David Cruz and the energy team faced the biggest challenge. The thermal differential generators required precision that their tools barely possessed. They built prototype after prototype. Each one either failed to generate enough power or burned out under the stress. But they kept refining, improving, learning. 6 months after Lyra visit, the colony held another meeting. The change was visible in people's faces. They looked tired, but there was energy there now. Purpose. They had been working harder than ever, but they were no longer just maintaining, they were building. Helen stood at the front again with team leaders beside her. The water filtration system is operational, she announced. We are now running at 90% capacity. Our water rationing can be reduced. The composite materials are in production. We have begun replacing critical structural components. The thermal generators are still in testing, but early results are promising. The hall erupted in cheers. People hugged each other, some were crying. Kyle stood to the side, watching and feeling something he had not felt in years. Pride not just in the accomplishments, but in the people who had achieved them. But Helen raised her hand for quiet. We have made progress, she said. But we are not finished. The ore deposits are still running low. We need to find new sources or new uses for what we have. The visitor gave us tools to survive, but we need to figure out how to thrive. Kyle stepped forward. Have been thinking about that. He said the materials we learned to create, we could export them. Other colonies, other stations, they would pay for materials that are stronger and lighter than standard metals. We could become manufacturers instead of just miners. Patricia Wong nodded. We would need to scale up production significantly, but the technology we developed, it could work. We could create jobs that do not depend on the mines, David Cruz added. And if we get the thermal generators fully operational, we could sell power too. This region of space is short on reliable energy sources. Stations would pay for stable power. Generation ideas flowed through the crowd. People who had been passive for years were now actively planning their future. They were no longer just surviving. They were imagining possibilities. The transformation was remarkable. That night, Kyle stood at the observation window looking out at the stars. He thought about Lyra and her dragons, wondering where they were now, what other struggling colony they might be visiting. He understood now what she had been trying to teach him. It was not about the technology. It was never about the technology. It was about remembering that struggle created strength. That adaptation was survival. That imperfection was not a flaw but a feature. Helen joined him at the window. You know, she said, I looked up the records after she left. There was a similar encounter, 300 years ago. Different colony, different sector, but the same visitor, the same dragon lady. Kyle turned to look at her. What happened to that colony? Helen smiled. They survived. They took the hints she gave them and built something new. They became a major hub for advanced materials manufacturing. The technology they developed from her suggestions changed how humans built things in space. She visits colonies that are failing, Kyle said slowly. Colonies that have no other hope, and she gives them just enough to save themselves. if they are willing to work for it. Yes, Helen said. And in doing so, she learns. She watches how we adapt, how we struggle, how we turn hints into solutions. She studies human ingenuity because her people lost theirs. Kyle looked back out at the stars, feeling a connection to something vast and ancient. We are teaching her, he said, just like she taught us. Exactly, Helen said. And maybe that is the real gift. Not the technology, but the reminder that every struggle has value, that every failure teaches something that survival requires, constant adaptation. They stood together in comfortable silence. The colony hummed around them, systems running smoothly, people working with purpose. The future was uncertain, but that was all right. Uncertainty meant possibility, meant room to adapt, meant life. 1 year after Lyra visit Vega, 7 was unrecognizable. The colony that had been slowly dying was now thriving. The water filtration crystals grew in carefully tended chambers, producing clean water at rates that exceeded even optimistic projections. The thermal generators hummed steadily, providing more power than the colony needed. The excess was stored and sold to passing ships. The composite materials that Patricia Wong's team had developed were now being manufactured in 3 large facilities. Trade ships arrived weekly to pick up shipments. Stations across the sector wanted the lightweight, strong materials that Vega 7 produced. The colony had gone from being forgotten to being essential. Kyle stood in the new research facility watching a team of engineers test a prototype for improved crystal growth. They were young people who had come to Vega 7 specifically to work on the technologies that had made the colony famous. The population had grown to over 600 people wanted to be part of something exciting. One of the engineers, a woman named Claire Martinez, approached him holding a tablet. We have been analyzing the original data files, she said. The ones the visitor left. There are patterns in them, suggestions for technologies we have not explored yet. Kyle looked at the tablet, seeing diagrams that were familiar but also new. What are you thinking? Claire pointed to a section. I think there might be a way to improve our mining efficiency. The crystals we grow for water filtration, they have properties that could be adapted for ore extraction. If we could develop that, it would extend the life of our mines indefinitely. Kyle smiled. That is exactly what she wanted us to do. Not just follow her hints, but expand on them. Create our own solutions. Tell me what you need as. Claire explained her ideas. Kyle felt proud. This was the legacy Lyra had left. Not just technology, but a mindset. People on Vega 7 no longer accepted limits. They looked at problems as opportunities. They experimented and failed and tried again. They had learned to adapt. That evening, Kyle received a message from Helen asking him to come to the observation deck. When he arrived, he found her staring out at the stars with an expression he could not read. What is wrong? He asked. Helen turned to him. Nothing is wrong, she said. In fact, something remarkable has happened. I received a communication today from another colony in the Epsilon sector. They heard about our success, about the technologies we developed. They want to know if we would share our knowledge. Kyle felt something shift in his understanding. That is interesting. What did you tell them? Helen smiled. I told them we would help, but not by giving them complete solutions. I told them we would share the same hints and suggestions that were shared with us. I told them they would need to adapt the ideas to their own situation, to learn through experimentation. Kyle laughed, suddenly understanding. We are doing what she did. We are passing on the lesson, not just the technology. Exactly, Helen said. And there is more. 3 other colonies have reached out. Similar situations, struggling with failing equipment, running out of resources. They all heard about Vega 7. They want to know how we survived. Kyle walked to the window, looking out at the darkness between stars. She created a pattern, he said quietly. She visits failing colonies, gives them tools to save themselves. Those colonies thrive and then help other colonies. And those colonies help others. It spreads. Helen joined him at the window. It is more than that. She said, I have been researching historical records going back centuries. Every major advancement in human space technology can be traced back to colonies that had impossible breakthroughs, colonies that were failing and suddenly developed new solutions. You think she has been doing this for a long time? Kyle said, I think she has been guiding human development for centuries. Helen said, not controlling it, not directing it, just nudging, giving struggling people the tools to save themselves. And in doing so, pushing humanity to become more adaptable, more creative, more resilient. Kyle thought about the dragons, about their intelligent eyes watching him, work learning from him. Why would she do that? Why invest so much time in a young species like ours? Because her people are dying. Helen said, not physically but culturally. They stopped adapting, stopped growing. They became perfect. And in doing so, they stopped living. She studies us to remember what her people lost, and maybe she hopes that by helping us she can learn how to save them. They stood in silence for a while, watching ships come and go from the station, trade vessels bringing materials, and taking away the products Vega 7 manufactured, passenger ships bringing new colonists, people who wanted to be part of the transformation. I wonder if we will see her again, Kyle said. Helen shook her head. Probably not. According to the records, colonies she visits only see her once. She plants the seed and moves on. By the time that colony is thriving, she is somewhere else, helping another group of desperate people. Kyle felt a strange mixture of gratitude and sadness. He wanted to thank her, wanted to show her what they had accomplished, but perhaps that was not necessary. Perhaps she knew. Perhaps that was the whole point. That night, Kyle could not sleep. He went to the research facility and pulled up the original data files that Lyra had left. He had studied them hundreds of times, but now he looked with new eyes. He was searching for patterns, for hints about who she really was. Deep in the files, he found something he had never noticed before. It was not technical data, but text, a message written in symbols that the translation software had ignored because they did not seem important. Kyle ran them through different translation protocols and finally found one that worked. The message was simple. To those who struggle, remember that survival is not about lasting forever. It is about adapting to change. It is about taking broken things and making them work. It is about learning from every failure. My people forgot this, and we are fading. Do not forget your struggle is your strength. Your imperfection is your power. Keep adapting. Keep learning. Keep teaching others what you learn. This is how species survive. This is how cultures thrive. Kyle read the message 3 times, feeling tears on his face. She had not just given them technology, she had given them philosophy. A way of thinking about problems, a reminder that their struggles had value. He thought about the dragons, about how they had watched him work, learning from his improvisation. Perhaps that was the real gift. Not the data or the repairs, but the example. The demonstration that imperfect solutions created by desperate people could be more effective than perfect systems that never adapted. Kyle saved the message and sent it to everyone on the station. By morning, it had spread further. Other colonies that Vega 7 was helping, other stations that were implementing similar technologies. The message went viral across human space. People started calling it the Dragon Lady philosophy. The idea that struggle created strength, that imperfection enabled adaptation, that survival required constant learning. It became more than words. It became a movement. 6 months later, Kyle stood on the same observation deck watching the stars. He was older, now his hair starting to gray. Vega 7 had grown into a major hub. The colony that had been dying was now teaching others how to thrive. Helen joined him carrying 2 cups of coffee. Real coffee. Not the synthetic stuff they had survived on before. One of the luxuries their success had brought them. I received another message today, she said. A colony in the Gamma sector. They are implementing our crystal growth techniques. They say it is saving them. Kyle smiled good. That is what she wanted. The pattern continues. Helen looked thoughtful. Do you think she knows what we have done? How far the message has spread? Kyle thought about the dragons, about their ancient, intelligent eyes. "I think she knows," he said. "I think she has always known." This was always the plan. Not to save one colony, but to teach humanity a lesson that would spread to remind us that our greatest strength is our ability to adapt, to struggle to survive. And somewhere in the deep darkness between galaxies, Lyra smiled as her dragons curled around her. She had just left another failing colony on the edge of known space. She had given them hints, suggestions enough to save themselves if they chose to struggle for it. The dragons purred contentedly, their minds filled with new observations, new examples of human ingenuity. They had watched desperate people create solutions from nothing. They had learned once again that perfection was a trap, and imperfection was freedom. Lyra closed her eyes and thought about her own people, about their beautiful, perfect dying civilization. She had been searching for centuries for a way to save them, and she had finally found it. Not in technology, but in philosophy. Not in perfection, but in the willingness to struggle. She would return home soon, with lessons learned from 1,000 desperate colonies, with examples of adaptation and survival, with proof that imperfection was not weakness but the very foundation of life. And maybe, just maybe, her people would listen. They would remember what they had forgotten. They would choose to struggle again, to adapt, to live, rather than simply existing in eternal perfect stagnation. The ship moved through impossible space, and Lyra smiled because once again, humanity had proven that broken things in clever hands could become something magnificent, and in teaching them she had learned the most important lesson of all. Survival was not about lasting forever. It was about being willing to change,